The neighborhood basked in the warmth of a sunny afternoon, but beneath its picturesque charm, a tension lingered. One that wasn't immediately visible, but could be felt in the cautious glances and unspoken boundaries. The air was still, save for the faint hum of a passing car and the distant laughter of children playing a street away. Jake Barnes drove slowly, his patrol car gliding down the clean, tree-lined avenue. His eyes scanned the surroundings, not out of genuine curiosity, but out of habit. The habit of someone who had spent years assuming the worst before knowing the truth. He tapped the steering wheel with restless fingers, his gaze settling on a man walking on the sidewalk a few houses ahead. Darius Carter moved with quiet confidence, his tailored suit catching the sunlight as he strolled past the pristine homes. He carried himself with an air of assurance, yet the faint furrow in his brow betrayed a sense of awareness, a readiness for what might come. Jake narrowed his eyes. He knew most of the residents in this area, at least by face. This man? He wasn't one of them. Jake pulled the car over and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate heaviness. "Hey," Jake called out, his tone clipped, carrying the weight of implied authority. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Darius stopped and turned, his expression calm but measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jake walked closer, his posture rigid. "Just wondering what brings you to this neighborhood." "I'm here for a meeting," Darius replied simply, his voice steady. "A meeting?" Jake repeated, skepticism lacing his words. "Where exactly?" Darius tilted his head slightly, his composure unshaken. "That's personal. I'm not obligated to explain my every move." Jake's jaw tightened. His training told him to remain professional, but his biases whispered louder. "You see," he said, forcing a thin smile, "this is a quiet neighborhood. People like to know who's coming and going." Darius let the comment hang in the air for a moment before replying. "And do you ask everyone on this street that same question?" Jake's forced smile faded. "Listen, I don't want any trouble here. If you have nothing to hide, why not tell me where you're headed?" "I've done nothing wrong," Darius said firmly, "and I'd prefer to go about my day." The words struck Jake as defiance, a challenge to his authority. His hand hovered near his radio, his voice hardening. "I'm asking you again, what are you doing here?" By now, a few residents had begun to notice. A man watering his lawn paused, his hand on the hose. A woman across the street peeked out from behind her curtains. Phones were discreetly raised, recording the unfolding scene. Darius glanced around briefly, noting the growing audience but keeping his focus on Jake. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I don't think this conversation is about safety. It's about assumptions, and I won't justify myself to satisfy them." Jake's frustration boiled over. "Turn around," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Darius frowned, his calm demeanor finally cracking just slightly. "You're making a mistake." Jake ignored him, grabbing Darius's arm and locking the cuffs in place. The murmurs from the small crowd grew louder, the tension thick in the air. A man stepped forward cautiously, his voice tentative. "Officer, I think you've got the wrong idea." Jake shot him a warning glare. "Stay back." The man hesitated, his shoulders slumping as he retreated. Darius shook his head slowly, exhaling sharply through his nose. As Jake led Darius toward the patrol car, he caught sight of the phones recording him, the pointed gazes of the onlookers. The weight of their stares was heavy, but he pushed it aside, his grip tightening on Darius's arm. In the growing silence, a voice from the crowd muttered, "This isn't right." Jake heard it, but he didn't respond. He was too focused on maintaining control, unjustifying his actions to himself even as doubt began to creep in. And as Darius sat silently in the back of the patrol car, his expression unreadable, the sound of murmurs and the sight of flashing screens hinted at something much larger than the moment itself. Jake grabbed his radio, his grip tightening as he cast another wary glance at Darius. His voice, steady but edged with tension, broke the air. "Dispatch, I've got a suspicious individual on Willow Drive. Send backup." The words hung heavy in the air. Darius exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he watched Jake with unflinching eyes. "You're making a mistake," Darius said, his tone calm but firm. Jake scoffed, his hand hovering near his belt. "That so?" "Then maybe you should explain why you're here." Darius didn't waver. "I already told you. I'm here for a meeting. I don't owe you anything more than that." Jake's lips pressed into a thin line. He couldn't place it. Whether it was Darius's calmness or the subtle authority in his voice, but something about the man's demeanor grated on him. "You think this is arrogance, don't you?" Darius said, reading Jake's expression. His voice was quiet now, almost reflective. "It's not. It's just experience. I've been here before." Jake frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Darius didn't answer. He simply looked away, his gaze steadying on the growing cluster of neighbors gathering at a safe distance. For a moment, Jake's vision blurred, and he was back in his childhood home. A small, neat house on a quiet, predominantly white street. His father sat at the dining table, the evening news droning in the background. "Always be careful," his father had said, pointing a finger at him. "You see someone who doesn't belong, you don't wait to find out if they're trouble. You act. Better safe than sorry." Those words had stuck, their weight as solid as the badge on his chest. Jake blinked, shaking off the memory. Meanwhile, Darius stood motionless, his mind elsewhere. His journey flashed before him. Childhood mornings in a cramped apartment, the whispered prayers of his mother as she left for her second job, the taunts he'd endured in school, and later the cold stares in boardrooms, the barriers he had to shatter to prove he belonged. His rise to the FBI wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a rebellion against every whispered doubt and outright denial of his worth. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder. Someone, emboldened by the growing crowd, called out, "Leave the man alone, officer." Jake's head snapped toward the voice, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. He turned back to Darius. "Empty your pockets." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I said so," Jake snapped. Darius sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets and pulling out a phone, a set of keys and a folded piece of paper. He placed them on the hood of the patrol car without a word. Jake rummaged through them, finding nothing out of place. Satisfied, but unwilling to relent, he gestured toward the bag slung over Darius's shoulder. "And the bag?" Darius handed it over, his patience wearing thin. "You won't find anything." Jake opened it and rifled through its contents. Documents, a laptop, and a book. His brow furrowed as he found nothing incriminating. Frustration bubbled under his skin. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd, clutching her purse tightly. "Officer, I know him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He's not causing trouble." Jake glared at her. "Ma'am, I suggest you step back." "But I said, step back." Jake barked, his tone final. The woman froze, then reluctantly retreated. The crowd began to stir uneasily, their discontent palpable. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Darius said quietly, breaking the tension. Jake chuckled dryly. "Oh yeah? Who are you then?" Darius leaned slightly closer, his voice steady and deliberate. Someone who knows the law better than you do. Someone who has seen this play out before and knows exactly where it's going. Jake bristled, dismissing the statement with a wave of his hand. Empty threats won't work here. Darius didn't respond, his expression unreadable. The narrative seemed to slow, weaving itself into the broader story of history. The parallels were undeniable. Black men in positions of power brought low by assumptions, the weight of their authority stripped away in moments of prejudice. Darius was no exception, his achievements and rank offering no shield against the unspoken rules that society still held on to. The crowd, now larger and louder, began to push back more boldly. "This isn't right," someone shouted. "Let him go," another voice demanded. Jake glanced around nervously, the energy in the air shifting. He knew he was losing control, not just of the situation but of the narrative being shaped around him. But even then he couldn't stop. His pride, his training, and the weight of his own past drove him to stand firm. And in the silence that followed, Darius waited. The screech of tires announced the arrival of 2 more patrol cars. Uniformed officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting on their belts as they assessed the scene. Jake straightened, his stance brimming with authority. "All right, we're handling this," Jake said, gesturing to the other officers. "Stay sharp." Darius stood unmoving, his posture composed despite the escalating tension. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some voices rising in frustration. "Is this really necessary?" someone shouted from the back. Jake ignored the comment, waving his hand dismissively as his focus stayed on Darius. One of the backup officers, a younger man with a sharp gaze, paused as he looked at Darius. Recognition flickered across his face. Stepping closer to Jake, he spoke in a low tone. Jake, I think I know who he is," the officer said hesitantly. Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen him before. Pretty sure he's FBI, high-ranking." Jake stiffened, disbelief crossing his face. "You're kidding." "I'm not," the officer insisted. "You might want to check with him before this goes any further." Jake shook his head. "It's probably a misunderstanding. Let's just stick to protocol." The officer stepped back, his face troubled but unwilling to challenge Jake further. Darius exhaled quietly, reaching into his inner jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. His movements, though calm, immediately put Jake on edge. "Hands where I can see them," Jake barked. Darius froze, his eyes locking with Jake's. "Relax, officer, I'm just reaching for my badge." With measured precision, Darius pulled out a leather case and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge and ID card. The silence was deafening as the weight of his words landed. "Darius Carter," he said, his voice steady, "Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The crowd gasped audibly, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Jake's jaw dropped as his confidence crumbled, the reality of his mistake hitting him like a freight train. Jake stumbled over his words. I didn't know." "That much is clear," Darius interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. "But it's not about who I am. It's about what you assumed." The backup officers exchanged uneasy glances, their postures shifting as the dynamic of the scene changed. "You called for backup," Darius continued, "not because I posed a threat, but because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs in this neighborhood, isn't that right?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Darius took a step closer, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "You see a man in a suit walking through an upscale neighborhood, and your first instinct is suspicion. Why is that?" Jake's hands trembled slightly at his sides. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Darius interjected. "This isn't just about you, Jake. It's about a system that taught you to see me as a threat before you saw me as a man." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, voices calling out in agreement. Darius paused, his gaze softening as he addressed not just Jake, but everyone around him. "When I was 17, I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. A case of mistaken identity," they said. "I spent 2 days in a holding cell before anyone even bothered to look at my alibi." The crowd listened intently, their anger momentarily replaced by somber reflection. "That experience could have broken me," Darius continued, "but it didn't. It made me determined to rise above it, to prove that I was more than the assumptions made about me. And now, here I am, leading the very system that once failed me." Jake's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I didn't mean—" "Intent doesn't erase impact," Darius said, cutting him off. "But understanding the impact can lead to change." The juxtaposition of Darius's position as FBI director and the treatment he had just endured wasn't lost on anyone. It was a stark reminder of how deep prejudice ran, even in the face of undeniable success. The crowd's anger began to resurface, their voices rising once more. "This is what we're tired of," someone shouted. "About time things change." But amidst the frustration there was also admiration for Darius's composure and his powerful words. Jake, overwhelmed with guilt and shame, finally looked Darius in the eye. I don't know what to say." "Start by reflecting on why you acted the way you did," Darius said simply. "And then figure out what you're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again." Jake nodded slowly, his expression a mix of regret and realization. Darius turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," he said. "It's about all of us. What we allow, what we accept, and what we're willing to change. Each of us has a role to play in building a society where justice truly means justice for all." The crowd fell silent, his words sinking in. Darius gave Jake one last look, then walked away, leaving the officers and the onlookers to grapple with the weight of what had just unfolded. The precinct buzzed with tension as Jake sat in the small, sterile conference room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Across from him, a senior investigator flipped through a file. The silence was suffocating. "Officer Mitchell," the investigator began, his voice calm but firm. "Given the circumstances of the incident and the evidence presented, an official investigation into your conduct has been launched." Jake nodded, his throat dry. "I understand." The investigator leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "This isn't just about one mistake. This is about what that mistake represents to the people we serve. I suggest you think hard about what led you here." Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing with regret and guilt. The incident, caught on a bystander's phone, had gone viral overnight. On the courthouse steps, community leaders and activists gathered, their voices echoing through the streets. "This isn't an isolated event," one activist declared into a megaphone. "It's a symptom of a system that needs accountability and reform." The crowd roared in agreement, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling." Cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to capture the growing momentum. "We're not just asking for change," another speaker said. "We're demanding it." Standing before a wall of microphones, Darius faced the press with unwavering composure. The room was packed, the air electric with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "what happened to me is not unique. It's part of a larger pattern, one that has persisted for far too long. But let me be clear, this is not about demonizing individuals. It's about addressing a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. The room fell silent, his words striking a chord. We need to educate, to hold institutions accountable, and to commit to real reform. Because until we confront these issues head-on, we will continue to fail the very people we are meant to protect. The flash of cameras punctuated his powerful statement as the world watched. In a dimly lit classroom, Jake sat at the back of a small group, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. A trainer stood at the front, gesturing to a slide that read, "Understanding implicit bias." Bias isn't always intentional, the trainer explained, but the impact is what matters. The goal here isn't to assign blame, it's to foster understanding and change. Jake stared at the floor, the words hitting closer to home than he expected. He thought of Darius's calm authority, the crowd's outrage, and the look of disappointment on the face of the officer who'd recognized Darius. Later, during a breakout discussion, a fellow officer shared, "I didn't realize how much my assumptions shaped my actions." It's eye-opening. Jake hesitated before speaking. "I didn't either," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm starting to." In a modest community center, Darius sat with a group of young leaders, their eyes filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. "You're the future," Darius said, his tone warm but firm. "Change starts with people like you, those willing to challenge the system from within and inspire others to do the same." A young woman raised her hand. "But how do we stay hopeful when it feels like progress is so slow?" Darius smiled gently. "By remembering that every step forward matters. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when we refuse to give up." The room buzzed with renewed energy as the conversation continued, each voice contributing to the vision of a brighter future. At the park, children laughed and shouted as they chased a basketball across the court. Darius leaned against a nearby fence, a small smile playing on his lips. Their joy was infectious, a stark contrast to the heaviness of recent events. He watched as a young boy passed the ball to a girl, their teamwork seamless. In their laughter, he saw the promise of a world where differences were celebrated, not judged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Darius's voice carried over the scene in a reflective narration. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey, often fraught with setbacks and struggles. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a day when no one is judged by the color of their skin." The scene faded to black, leaving only the sound of children's laughter echoing in the background, a poignant reminder of hope for the future.